On the night of July 23, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey stood on the bridge of USS Barb as she sliced through the black waters off the coast of Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin Island. The submarine had already earned her reputation as one of the most aggressive boats in the Pacific Fleet, but what Fluckey was contemplating that night would rewrite the entire rulebook of submarine warfare. No submarine in history had ever landed a shore party on enemy territory to blow up a train, yet that was exactly what this audacious commander intended to do before dawn broke over the Japanese Empire. The idea had germinated weeks earlier during Barb's 11th war patrol. Fluckey had noticed something peculiar while studying coastal reconnaissance photographs, a railway line running parallel to the shoreline, close enough to the beach that a determined raiding party might reach it. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan's northern territories depended heavily on rail transport to move supplies, troops, and raw materials vital to the crumbling war effort. A successful attack on this artery would not only destroy valuable cargo, but would send psychological shock waves through an enemy already reeling from relentless American advances across the Pacific. According to declassified naval records from the National Archives, Fluckey presented his unconventional plan to his crew with characteristic enthusiasm. The submarine's wardroom fell silent as officers absorbed the magnitude of what their commander proposed. Lieutenant William Walker, the boat's executive officer, was the first to speak, pointing out the obvious dangers: Japanese coastal patrols, the possibility of shore batteries, the risk of leaving the submarine vulnerable while crew members were ashore, and the technical challenge of constructing an explosive device sophisticated enough to derail a speeding train. But Fluckey had already anticipated every objection. He had handpicked 8 volunteers from among the crew, selecting men with demolition training, railway experience, or simply the right combination of nerve and physical fitness. Chief Torpedoman Paul Saunders would lead the shore party, accompanied by electrician's mate Billy Hatfield, signalman Francis Sever, and 5 others whose names would soon be etched into the annals of naval history. The submarine approached the Patience Bay area under cover of darkness, her periscope barely breaking the surface as Fluckey studied the coastline through the lens. The beach appeared deserted, but appearances in wartime were often deceiving. Japanese forces had fortified much of their coastal territory, and even a small garrison could spell disaster for the raiding party. The commander ordered Barb to close to within 900 yards of shore, close enough that the landing party could reach the beach quickly in their rubber raft, but far enough that the submarine could dive if patrol boats appeared. As midnight approached, the selected crew members assembled in the forward torpedo room, their faces blackened with burnt cork, dressed in dark clothing that would blend with the shadows. Each man carried a carefully wrapped package of explosives, detonators, and wire. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking equipment one final time, while the submarine's diesel engines rumbled beneath their feet. The rubber raft hit the water at precisely 12:30 in the morning on July 24, 1945, carrying 8 men who were about to attempt something no submariners had ever dared. Chief Torpedoman Paul Saunders sat in the bow, his eyes scanning the dark shoreline for any sign of Japanese sentries. Behind him, the other raiders paddled with measured strokes, their movements synchronized to minimize noise and splashing. USS Barb remained on the surface behind them, her 4-inch deck gun manned and ready to provide covering fire if the mission went sideways. The journey to shore took 18 agonizing minutes. Every shadow on the beach could conceal an enemy position. Every sound carried the potential of discovery. But the raiders reached the rocky shore without incident, quickly dragging their raft above the tide line and concealing it behind a cluster of boulders. Saunders raised his hand, signaling the team to freeze while he listened for any indication they had been spotted. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves and the distant cry of a seabird. The railway line lay approximately 500 yards inland, separated from the beach by a gradually rising slope covered in scrub vegetation. According to intelligence reports that Fluckey had studied aboard Barb, trains ran along this route several times daily, transporting coal from the mines at Oro to processing facilities further south. The raiders moved quickly but cautiously, spreading out in a loose formation as they climbed toward their objective. Electrician's mate Billy Hatfield carried the most critical component of their mission: a micro switch salvaged from one of Barb's torpedoes, modified to serve as a pressure-sensitive trigger. When the raiders finally reached the railway embankment, they paused to catch their breath and assess the terrain. The tracks stretched into darkness in both directions, and Saunders chose a curve where an approaching train would be traveling at higher speed, maximizing the destructive potential of their trap. The men worked with urgent efficiency, digging beneath one of the rails to create a hollow space for their explosives. They had brought 55 pounds of carefully shaped charges, enough to not only break the rail but to crater the roadbed beneath it. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Official History of U.S. Naval Operations in World War II, the technical challenges of this operation were considerable. The raiders needed to ensure the explosive device would detonate from the weight and vibration of a passing train while remaining stable enough not to trigger prematurely from wind, wildlife, or thermal expansion of the rails. Hatfield's modified micro-switch proved ingenious. Placed between the rail and a supporting tie, it would compress under the weight of a locomotive, completing an electrical circuit that would fire the detonators. The raiders buried their explosives and carefully arranged the triggering mechanism, then disguised their work with gravel and dirt scraped from the surrounding area. The entire installation took 47 minutes, during which every man remained acutely aware that Japanese patrols could appear at any moment. Signalman Francis Sever, positioned as lookout, twice signaled the team to freeze when he heard distant voices, but the sounds faded without materializing into actual threats. With the demolition charge successfully planted, Saunders made a decision that elevated this raid from mere sabotage to psychological warfare. Rather than immediately retreating to the beach, he ordered his team to move further up the line and cut the telegraph wires running parallel to the tracks. This would prevent railway officials from warning other stations about the attack, potentially causing additional trains to blunder into the destruction zone. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood on USS Barb's bridge, binoculars pressed against his face as he stared toward the invisible shoreline, where his raiders had disappeared nearly 2 hours earlier. The submarine rocked gently in the coastal waters, vulnerable and exposed on the surface with half her normal complement aboard. Every instinct honed through years of submarine warfare screamed at him to dive, to seek the protective depths that had saved countless submarines from detection and destruction. Yet diving now would abandon his men to certain capture and probable execution. Lieutenant William Walker emerged from the conning tower, his expression tense. "Radar contact, Captain. Small vessel approximately 7,000 yards and closing from the northeast." The words hung in the night air like a death sentence. A Japanese patrol boat at this range could reach Barb's position in less than 20 minutes, and if it spotted the American submarine on the surface, the resulting engagement would certainly alert shore installations to the presence of enemy forces in the area. Fluckey calculated rapidly, weighing impossible options. The raiders needed at least another hour to complete their mission and return to the beach. Diving now would save the submarine, but doom 8 men. Remaining on the surface risked not only Barb and her remaining crew, but potentially compromised the entire operation if the patrol boat detected them before the demolition charge could be triggered. The commander made his decision with the cold clarity that characterized his command style throughout the war. "Come right to 090 degrees. Maintain surface running. Load forward tubes 1 through 4 with torpedoes. Prepare to dive on my command only." Barb's diesel engines rumbled louder as the helmsman brought the submarine onto her new heading, angling away from the approaching patrol craft while maintaining position close enough to support the shore party if needed. The gun crew on the forward deck tensed, their 4-inch gun tracking in the direction of the radar contact. Ashore, Paul Saunders and his raiders were experiencing their own crisis. After successfully planting their explosive device and cutting the telegraph wires, the team had begun their withdrawal toward the beach when signalman Francis Sever spotted lights moving along a coastal road roughly 1 mile south of their position. The lights appeared to be from military vehicles, possibly a routine patrol, but their trajectory would bring them dangerously close to the point where the raiders planned to re-enter the water. According to later debriefings preserved in the USS Barb's War Patrol reports, Saunders faced a critical decision. The original extraction plan called for the team to return to the beach at the same location where they had landed, where their rubber raft remained hidden behind the boulders. But approaching Japanese vehicles made that route potentially suicidal. The alternative was to move further north along the coastline, adding perhaps another mile to their journey and increasing the risk that Barb would be forced to dive before they could reach safety. Saunders chose survival over convenience. Using hand signals, he directed his team to parallel the shoreline northward, moving through the darkness with weapons ready and hearts pounding. Every few minutes, someone would glance over their shoulder toward the railway embankment they had booby-trapped, wondering if their explosive device would actually function, or if this entire risky expedition would amount to nothing more than a terrifying nocturnal hike through enemy territory. The patrol boat that Walker had spotted on radar continued its approach toward USS Barb's position. Through his binoculars, Flucky could now make out the vessel's silhouette against the marginally lighter sky to the northeast. It appeared to be a small subcatcher or perhaps a converted fishing boat, certainly no match for Barb's firepower in a surface engagement, but any combat action would create noise, light, and radio traffic that would bring additional Japanese forces down upon them. At precisely 3:47 in the morning on July 24, 1945, the sound that Paul Saunders and his raiders had been simultaneously dreading and anticipating rolled across the Karafuto landscape like approaching thunder. A train whistle somewhere to the south announced the approach of a locomotive steaming north along the coastal railway line. The 8 submariners, still making their way along the beach toward a new extraction point, froze in their tracks and turned their faces toward the invisible railway embankment approximately 400 yards inland. Electrician's mate Billy Hatfield, who had designed and installed the triggering mechanism, felt his pulse accelerate. Every aspect of their improvised detonation system had been theoretical until this moment. Would the modified microswitch actually function under the weight and vibration of a moving train? Had they positioned the explosives correctly beneath the rail? Were the electrical connections still intact after more than 3 hours exposed to the damp coastal air? Within seconds, they would learn whether this unprecedented raid would become a triumph of American ingenuity or a footnote of failed ambition. The train's approach grew steadily louder. Through the darkness, the raiders could now see a faint glow illuminating the sky above the railway line, probably from the locomotive's firebox as the engineer fed coal into the hungry boiler. According to post-war Japanese railway records that would later be examined by American intelligence officers, the train consisted of a Taipei C-58 steam locomotive, pulling 16 freight cars loaded with raw materials and manufactured goods destined for processing facilities in the southern portion of Hokkaido. Aboard USS Barb, Commander Flucky had managed to evade the approaching patrol boat by carefully adjusting his submarine's position, using the coastal terrain to mask Barb's radar signature while maintaining his vigil for the returning shore party. When the distant train whistle reached the LSU, "Submarine!" Every man on the bridge instinctively looked toward the shore, though the actual railway line was invisible beyond the coastal hills. Flucky glanced at his watch, calculating how much longer he could safely remain on the surface before the approaching dawn and increasing patrol activity would force him to dive. The explosion, when it came, exceeded everyone's expectations. A brilliant flash of orange and yellow light suddenly illuminated the inland hills, followed almost immediately by a thunderous detonation that echoed across the water, with enough force to be felt aboard the submarine nearly 2 miles offshore. A column of debris, smoke, and steam erupted skyward, momentarily painting the landscape in hellish colors before fading back to darkness. Secondary explosions followed as the train's cargo ignited, creating a chain reaction of destruction that would burn for hours. Hatfield's triggering mechanism had functioned perfectly. The weight of the locomotive rolling over the modified microswitch had compressed the contact points, completing the electrical circuit and firing the detonators precisely as designed. 55 pounds of high explosives had detonated directly beneath the locomotive's driving wheels, simultaneously destroying a section of BEF rail, cratering the roadbed, and lifting the entire front portion of the train off the tracks. The locomotive, still driven forward by its tremendous momentum, had plowed off the embankment and down the slope, dragging freight cars behind it in a cascading disaster of twisting metal, splintering wood, and bursting cargo containers. As documented in the National Archives records of submarine operations in the Pacific Theater, the raiders could hear screaming and shouting from the direction of the wreck as the train's crew and any passengers struggled to escape the destruction. Japanese accounts from survivors would later describe the scene as apocalyptic. The locomotive lying on its side, steam shrieking from ruptured pipes, freight cars accordioned together in impossible angles, and fires spreading rapidly through spilled cargo. The railway line that had been a vital artery for Japanese logistics in the region was now completely severed and would remain impassable for weeks of repairs. Paul Saunders allowed himself precisely 30 seconds to appreciate the spectacular success of their mission before snapping his team back to the urgent reality of their situation. The explosion had certainly alerted every Japanese military installation within 10 miles of their position. Shore batteries would be manned, patrol boats would be scrambled, and infantry units would be dispatched to hunt for saboteurs. The raiders needed to reach USS Barb immediately, before the enemy net closed around them. The explosion that had just torn apart a Japanese supply train created both opportunity and mortal danger for the 8 American raiders now sprinting across the rocky beach toward their hidden rubber raft. The spectacular destruction inland had drawn Japanese forces like moths to flame, with vehicle lights suddenly appearing on multiple roads converging on the railway line from different directions. This movement away from the coast gave Paul Saunders and his team precious minutes to reach the water, but the clock was ticking with merciless speed toward dawn when their presence would become impossible to conceal. Signalman Francis Sever reached the raft first, tearing away the rocks and driftwood they had used to camouflage it during the inland raid. The rubber craft appeared intact, despite hours of exposure. But in the darkness, there was no way to verify it hadn't been punctured or compromised. The raiders would simply have to launch it and trust that their hastily concealed vessel would carry them back to USS Barb before they drowned in the cold coastal waters or were cut down by Japanese fire. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood on Barb's bridge, his binoculars trained on the shoreline where he knew his men must be attempting their extraction. The submarine had closed to within 700 yards of the beach, well within range of shore batteries if the Japanese had position net artillery along this stretch of coast. Behind Fluckey, the 4-inch deck gun remained manned and loaded, ready to provide covering fire if the raiders came under attack during their withdrawal. Lieutenant Walker had prepared the submarine for emergency crash dive, calculating that Barb could reach safe depth in 48 seconds if enemy aircraft or surface vessels suddenly appeared. The rubber raft splashed into the water at 4:18 in the morning, carrying 8 exhausted men whose adrenaline reserves were nearly depleted after more than 4 hours of operation in enemy territory. They paddled with desperate urgency, their muscles burning with the effort of propelling the overloaded craft through the gentle swells. Behind them on shore, searchlights had begun sweeping the coastline as Japanese forces initiated a systematic search for the saboteurs responsible for the railway disaster. According to the official patrol report later filed by Commander Fluckey and preserved in naval archives, the return journey took 23 minutes that felt like 23 hours to everyone involved. Halfway between shore and submarine, one of the raiders spotted a patrol boat rounding a coastal point approximately 2 miles to the south, its searchlight cutting white swaths through the darkness. The boat appeared to be moving slowly, probably conducting a methodical search pattern, but its course would eventually bring it into visual range of both the raft and the surface submarine. Fluckey saw the patrol boat simultaneously, and his mind shifted into the cold calculus of combat command. If the Japanese vessel detected Barb before the raiders reached safety, the submarine would face 3 equally terrible choices: dive immediately and abandon the shore party, remain surfaced and engage the enemy while the exposed raiders attempted to cover the remaining distance, or attempt to recover the raiders under fire while simultaneously fighting off an attacking patrol boat. None of these options promised survival for all involved. The submarine's lookout spotted the returning raft at 4:33, and within seconds, willing hands were reaching down to haul the exhausted raiders aboard. Paul Saunders came up last, his legs trembling from exertion as he climbed through the deck hatch and dropped into Barb's interior. He had barely cleared the ladder when Fluckey's voice cut through the submarine's internal communication system. "Clear the bridge! Dive! Dive! Dive!" The patrol boat's searchlight had swept across USS Barb's conning tower, just as the last lookout dropped below. Whether the Japanese crew had actually seen the American submarine in that brief illumination would remain unknown, but Fluckey took no chances. Barb's main vents opened with a roar of escaping air, and the submarine tilted downward into the protective depths, her hull groaning as she descended toward 200 feet. Through the hull, the crew could hear the patrol boat's propellers churning overhead, moving slowly in what might have been a search pattern, or might have been simple routine patrol activity. As USS Barb leveled off at depth and turned eastward toward deeper water, the raiders collapsed wherever they found space, their mission complete beyond anyone's expectations. They had become the first submarine crew in naval history to conduct a successful shore raid that destroyed a land target, and they had done so without suffering a single casualty. As USS Barb departed the hostile waters off Carafuto on July 24, 1945, the full scope of what her crew had accomplished began to crystallize. Commander Eugene Fluckey ordered the submarine to maintain deep running throughout the daylight hours, surfacing only after darkness fell to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat's stale interior atmosphere. In the wardroom, the 8 raiders who had gone ashore were being debriefed by Lieutenant Walker, who meticulously recorded every detail of the operation for the official patrol report that would eventually reach Pacific Fleet headquarters. The Japanese response to the railway sabotage proved more extensive than even Fluckey had anticipated. According to intercepted radio communications that Barb's radio men picked up during the following days, the destruction of the train had triggered a massive security alert throughout the Northern Territories. Japanese commanders initially suspected partisan activity, or possibly Soviet infiltrators, as the concept of American submariners coming ashore to blow up a train seemed too outlandish to consider seriously. This confusion worked in Barb's favor, as Japanese anti-submarine forces concentrated their search efforts in the wrong areas, while the American boat slipped away toward her next patrol zone. Intelligence estimates compiled after the war revealed the material impact of the raid. The destroyed train had been carrying 16 freight cars loaded with critical supplies, including raw materials for weapon manufacturing, food supplies for military installations, and communications equipment. The locomotive itself, a Type C-58, was one of only 73 such engines in service throughout Japan's northern territories, and its loss created immediate logistics complications. More significantly, the psychological impact rippled throughout the Japanese transportation network, with train crews becoming increasingly fearful about operating along coastal routes. When USS Barb returned to Pearl Harbor on August 14, 1945, Japan had already surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The timing meant that Barb's spectacular 11th Patrol, which had included not only the train raid but also the sinking of multiple ships and the destruction of numerous shore installations, would be among the final submarine operations of World War II. As noted in contemporary naval records from the Pacific Submarine Force, Fluckey's boat had established records for destruction that would stand unchallenged in submarine warfare history. The recognition that followed was unprecedented. Commander Eugene Fluckey received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during Barb's 11th Patrol, with the train raid specifically cited in the award citation as demonstrating extraordinary initiative and tactical brilliance. It was Fluckey's 4th Navy Cross and 1st Medal of Honor, making him one of the most decorated submarine commanders in American naval history. The 8 raiders who had gone ashore each received the Silver Star, the nation's 3rd highest decoration for valor in combat. USS Barb herself received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest organizational award in the American military system, for her exceptional performance throughout the war. According to official tallies, the submarine had sunk 17 enemy ships totaling approximately 100,000 tons during her 12 war patrols. She had destroyed numerous coastal installations, railroads, and bridges through daring surface bombardment missions, and had evacuated Allied intelligence personnel from behind enemy lines on multiple occasions. The train raid represented the culmination of Fluckey's innovative approach to submarine warfare, pushing beyond traditional concepts of undersea operations to strike the enemy in ways previously considered impossible. The submarine's crew understood they had participated in something historically unique. Years later, Paul Saunders would reflect that the raid succeeded because it combined meticulous planning with aggressive execution and considerable luck. If Japanese patrols had been positioned differently, if the modified microswitch had failed to function, if the approaching patrol boat had spotted Barb before the raiders returned, the operation would have ended in disaster. Instead, it became a testament to American ingenuity, courage, and the willingness to attempt operations that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. The technical innovations developed for the raid, particularly Billy Hatfield's modified torpedo microswitch, were studied by naval ordnance experts and influenced the development of pressure-triggered munitions in subsequent decades. The strategic concept of using submarines to land raiding parties against land targets would be refined and expanded in later conflicts, eventually evolving into specialized submarine units dedicated to special operations support. The train raid conducted by USS Barb's crew on July 23 and 24, 1945, represented far more than an isolated tactical success in the closing days of World War II. In the decades following the war, military historians and strategic analysts would recognize the operation as a pivotal moment in the evolution of submarine warfare, demonstrating that undersea vessels could project power beyond their traditional domain of attacking ships at sea. Commander Eugene Fluckey's willingness to think beyond conventional tactical limitations opened new possibilities for submarine employment that would influence naval doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond. Within the submarine force itself, the raid became legendary. Young officers attending submarine school in the post-war years studied Fluckey's patrol reports, analyzing not just the technical aspects of the operation, but the command philosophy that made such innovation possible. Fluckey had created an environment aboard Barb where crew members felt empowered to suggest unconventional ideas, where technical expertise was valued regardless of rank, and where calculated risks were considered acceptable when the potential rewards justified the danger. This leadership approach became a model for submarine commanders in subsequent generations. The physical artifacts of the raid took on almost sacred significance within the submarine community. USS Barb's battle flag, which crew members had modified to include a small locomotive symbol representing the destroyed train, became one of the most photographed and celebrated battle flags in naval history. When the submarine was finally decommissioned in 1954, after distinguished service during both World War II and the early Cold War period, her flag was preserved at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, where it remains on display today. The flag serves as a tangible connection to an operation that expanded the boundaries of what submarines and their crews could accomplish. The 8 raiders who went ashore that night in July 1945 found their lives permanently marked by the experience. Paul Saunders remained in the Navy, eventually retiring as a Master Chief Torpedo Man after 30 years of service. In interviews conducted during the 1980s and 90s, he consistently emphasized that the raid succeeded because every crew member aboard Barb, both those who went ashore and those who remained with the submarine, performed their duties with absolute professionalism under extraordinary pressure. Billy Hatfield, whose technical ingenuity had created the triggering mechanism that made the raid possible, left the Navy after the war and worked as an electrical engineer, though he never patented any designs related to his wartime innovations due to security classifications that remained in effect for decades. As referenced in retrospective analyses published in the Naval Institute's Proceedings Journal during the 1970s, the strategic impact of unconventional submarine operations like Barb's train raid extended beyond immediate tactical results. Japanese military planners in the final months of the war were forced to divert resources to defend coastal installations and infrastructure against potential submarine raids, resources that might otherwise have been concentrated against the advancing Allied forces. The psychological effect of knowing that American submarines could strike land targets from the sea created a sense of vulnerability that contributed to the general erosion of Japanese military morale in the war's closing stages. Commander Fluckey continued his naval career after World War II, eventually retiring as a Rear Admiral in 1972. Throughout his post-war service, he remained an advocate for innovation and aggressive tactics, arguing that military forces must constantly evolve their operational concepts to stay ahead of potential adversaries. He wrote extensively about submarine warfare and leadership, and his memoirs, published under the title Thunder Below, provided detailed insights into the thinking behind operations like the train raid. Fluckey remained actively engaged with the submarine community until his death in 2007 at age 93, regularly speaking at submarine command courses and reunions, where new generations of submariners could hear firsthand about the operation that had become legendary within their service. The Japanese perspective on the raid emerged gradually in the decades after the war. Former railway workers who had been involved in clearing the wreckage and repairing the damaged line provided accounts describing the extensive destruction caused by the American explosives. The locomotive had been so badly damaged that it was scrapped rather than rebuilt, and the freight cars had been carrying materials that were impossible to replace in the final weeks of the war. Japanese naval officers acknowledged in post-war interviews that they had never seriously considered the possibility that American submarines might land raiding parties to attack land targets, an oversight that Fluckey had brilliantly exploited. In the spring of 2009, a small group of American veterans and their families gathered at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, for a ceremony honoring the 64th anniversary of USS Barb's train raid. Only 2 of the original 8 raiders were still living by that time, both in their 80s, but they made the journey to stand before the preserved battle flag and share their memories with younger submariners who viewed these elderly men as living connections to a legendary chapter of naval history. The ceremony highlighted how the passage of time transforms historical events into stories that carry meaning beyond the participants themselves. The technical details of how 8 submariners accomplished what conventional wisdom declared impossible continue to fascinate military historians and engineers. Modern explosive ordnance disposal specialists who have studied the raid express amazement that Billy Hatfield's improvised triggering mechanism functioned properly on the first attempt, noting that even with contemporary technology and computer modeling, creating a reliable pressure-activated detonator under field conditions remains challenging. The fact that Barb's raiders achieved this using modified torpedo components and hand tools, working in darkness on enemy territory with Japanese patrols potentially nearby, speaks to both their technical competence and their extraordinary composure under pressure. The raid has been commemorated in various forms throughout the decades since World War II. Multiple books have documented the operation, each bringing different perspectives and additional research to bear on understanding what happened that night in July 1945. Documentary filmmakers have recreated the raid using interviews with participants, archival footage, and dramatic reconstructions. The History Channel featured the operation in their series on submarine warfare, introducing the story to audiences who might never have encountered it otherwise. Each retelling serves to keep alive the memory of what Commander Eugene Fluckey and his crew accomplished. For the submarine community specifically, the train raid represents an ideal that continues to influence operational thinking in the modern era. Contemporary submarine commanders still study Fluckey's decision-making process, analyzing how he balanced aggression with prudence, how he empowered his crew while maintaining command authority, and how he identified opportunities that others overlooked. The core lesson, that submarines are limited less by their technical capabilities than by the imagination and courage of their commanders and crews, remains relevant in an age of nuclear-powered vessels, equipped with vastly more sophisticated technology than USS Barb possessed in 1945. The geographic location where the raid occurred has changed dramatically since the war. Karafuto, the Japanese name for southern Sakhalin Island, became Soviet territory after Japan's surrender and is now part of Russia. The railway line that Barb's raiders attacked still exists in modified form, though it has been rebuilt and rerouted several times since 1945. No official memorial marks the exact spot where the train was destroyed, and the precise location remains a subject of minor historical debate, given the challenges of correlating wartime navigational data with contemporary mapping. The personal effects and equipment used during the raid have become historical treasures. The modified microswitch that Billy Hatfield created is part of the collection at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, carefully preserved as an artifact demonstrating American ingenuity under combat conditions. Photographs of the raiders preparing their equipment aboard Barb have been reproduced countless times in books and museums, frozen moments that capture the tension and determination that characterize the operation. Each artifact serves as a tangible link to an event that might otherwise seem too extraordinary to be believed. As the final veterans of World War II pass into history, operations like USS Barb's train raid transition from living memory into historical record. The last of the 8 raiders died in 2017, closing a direct human connection to that night in July 1945. Yet the story persists, carried forward by historians, by the submarine community that claims it as part of their heritage, and by anyone who finds inspiration in the account of ordinary individuals accomplishing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The raid endures not because it changed the war's outcome, which was already largely determined by that point, but because it demonstrates the human capacity for courage, innovation, and achievement against overwhelming odds.